Hi everyone, and welcome to our discussion today on this topic called as standard costs. Before we talk about what is the thought process, what is the idea of a standard costing, let's try to understand in terms of when we are doing a business, we also need to do an evaluation in respect of whether we are doing it in the right manner, whether whatever we are doing in our business, be it, let's say, incurring a cost, be it making a sales, be it earning a profit, is that what we expected it to be, or is that particular sale is maybe higher than what we expected or lower than what we expected, the costs higher than what we initially thought or lower than what we originally presumed, and let's say even for that matter the profit, whether what we were looking for, have we got the same profit or the figure is a little different than what we actually thought, right? So if I say that, I'm talking about standard costing as a topic or as a concept. We are trying to do an evaluation of what has happened versus what should have happened or what was supposed to happen, right? So when I look at this thing, evaluation of what has happened, I'm saying my actual performance versus what should have happened or what was supposed to happen. I'm saying this is what I expected, or even make it better or precise, this is what should have taken place. This is something which was supposed to happen. This is something that was ought to happen, and that is where I'm looking at my standard performance, right? So when I say I'm looking at my actual performance versus my standard performance, I would certainly want to do an evaluation of why this difference arose. Right? Now, of course, if I say that I was expecting a profit of $10,000, but instead I got a profit of $11,000, it could be a positive news. It is a positive news, but then I would certainly want to understand that whether when I was saying that I'm expecting a profit of $10,000, was it the right amount of profit that I was expecting? As in, whether my calculations of what my profit was supposed to be, is that calculation also correct or not? So at any point in time, whenever I'm measuring my actual performance versus the performance that was supposedly happening, or that was supposed to happen, or that was ought to happen, I'm trying to analyze that part. I'm trying to really see the root cause analysis. I'm just performing that root cause analysis in terms of what resulted into this difference in the actual performance versus the standard performance, right? So that is one core idea of the topic, standard costing. Of course, the moment I say standard costing, I'm probably focusing more onto this word called as cost, right? Predominantly, and probably that has been the focus of organizations to look at, what is the cost that we are incurring, and what is the cost that we were supposed to incur. So primarily the organizations have looked at cost as a bigger chunk in this particular section, but then it is not just confined to costs. It certainly looks at, even for that matter, revenue or let's say revenue and profitability, right? So if I say that I'm looking at standard costing and I'm evaluating every type of cost, it is not absolutely correct to say it or interpret it like this, right? So if I take some small basic examples around how does it work, let's have a look at it in terms of why probably standard costing as a topic, standard costing as a concept is of a practical relevance to any and every kind of a business, right? So let us say that if I look at any business, a business would make a plan, let us say to sell 10,000 units, let's say during the next reporting period. Let's say here we're talking about a month. Okay, so if I say that they want to sell 10,000 units, let's look at the actual position also. Let us say that this actual position of inventory, the inventory that is lying with the businesses, 2,000 units, and they would want to maintain the similar level of inventory. That means that my opening or closing inventory will remain 2,000 units, which means further that if I were to sell 10,000 units, I also need to plan my production as 10,000 units, right? So what we are seeing here is a company that plans for the future in terms of how many units of goods it wants to sell, right? How many items that it wants to sell, let's say in a particular period. It would go back, it would take a backward calculation and would of course plan its production accordingly, right? And if that is the case, of course, if it were a manufacturing setup, it would certainly want to plan its purchases also. Purchases of, let us say, raw material, right? Let us say for the sake of it that in this kind of a scenario, in this kind of a situation, this company, let's name this company as company X. So company X is planning that it would sell 10,000 units of goods during the next month. It maintains the same level of inventory for the opening as well as the closing levels, which means that whatever it is planning to sell, it would also want to make production of the same number of goods. And if it wants to produce these many goods, it would certainly need to make a purchase of raw material. Let us say for the sake of it that this raw material requirement is 1 kg of raw material for each unit of finished goods. 1 kg of raw material for each unit of finished goods. That means that the company now needs to plan a purchase of 10,000 kgs of raw material, right? So when I say that this purchase requirement is of 10,000 kgs of raw material, you certainly need to manage your working capital as well at this stage itself. You have not done anything so far. You have not bought any goods at this point in time. But what you are looking at, that if you intend to sell something for the next period, you need to plan your production. And since you need to plan your production, you need to plan also your purchases of raw material. And if you do so, you certainly need to manage your working capital. You need to be speaking with the suppliers of these raw material, right? That this is the expected purchasing in terms of the quantity that you want to make during the next period. This next period could be a month, it could be a week, it could be a quarter, it could be a half year, it could be a complete year. So what we are looking at is, if, for example, this sale is higher than 10,000 units. Let us say you are able to sell 10,500 units, right? So originally you thought that you will be able to sell 10,000 units, but in actuals you land up selling 10,500 units. That means what? It means that you have done something good in your sales. As in, you sold more than what you thought you would. Which means what? You are getting something called as a favorable result or a favorable difference between the actual performance versus the standard performance. The actual performance versus the performance that was supposed to take place, right? That is where you start measuring this difference. But then for this favorable result, there could also be some challenges associated. Let's even talk about that in terms of how do we get a connect between this difference and maybe some other difference in the entire cycle of this planning, right? Let us say that you got 10,500 units. You really wanted to maintain that inventory level of 2,000 units, which means that since you sold off 10,500 units, let's use some other color for that. Say that you sold 10,500 units actual, but you wanted to maintain the same inventory level, which means that you also produced, you also manufactured 10,500 units. And then you start looking at it, because your sales increased, your production levels also increased, and as a result, most likely your purchases of raw material increased as well. So let us say, if actually speaking, you landed up buying 10,500 kgs of raw material, it could have happened that since the purchases or the purchase was unplanned to the extent of this 500 kgs, you were thinking 10,000 of kgs of raw material will be purchased, but you landed up buying 10,500 kgs. Since the purchases were unplanned, you might not have spoken to your vendors about it. Your suppliers might not have been able to provide you, or let's say arrange for, the same additional quantity of the material. And that is where probably it could have happened that the price that you paid for that additional material could have been higher than you actually thought that it would be. Since you are buying something at the last moment, since you were not planning to make this purchase when you originally planned for the production, you realize that on the last moment, to make an extra sale, you had to make an extra purchase. You wanted to sell 500 units of goods over and above what you originally thought, and that is where you landed up buying 500 kgs of raw material over and above what you originally thought. It could be a case that the price that you paid was higher than what you thought you would have paid for, right? So around these lines, you would start seeing that yes, the price that you paid is an unfavorable result. But then this unfavorable result could be justified. This unfavorable result could be justified since you have something against it as a favorable result. You paid extra for the additional goods, but in return, you got extra income because of that. You sold off additional goods and you made a higher revenue for this, right? This is still something which is resulting into one positive change and one negative change, but it does not always happen the same way. There could be some very positive results, due to changes in circumstances, changing in pricing, a lot of suppliers coming in willing to sell goods to you at a reduced price than you thought, or it could be an absolutely difficult situation for you. The interest rates have increased, the demand for your goods have declined, and a lot of such factors may come where you start wondering in terms of who is responsible for such differences, because such differences clearly impact your planning, right? So you need to really find the actual reason, the root cause for such differences or for such variances to be able to take a judgment or a sound judgment for the future period, right? And that is where this topic, standard costing, becomes so practically relevant that you're able to use the given information, the given facts to predict how is your future going to be, right? And if there are any deviations from what you expected and what you got, you certainly want to find the reasons for that, so that a corrective action, an immediate action is taken by you to ensure that such deviations, whether positive or negative, they do not arise in future, right? So that is something which is the idea of standard costing. So we're going to talk about, of course, this in detail in terms of how does standard costing work, how does this come into picture, some definitions to begin with, and of course the practical side of the topic, right? The one thing that you want to take into consideration is that the difference between actual results and standard results is called as a variance, right? It is called as a variance, and a variance could be a positive variance, that is referred to as a favorable variance. It could be a negative variance and is called as an adverse variance, right? So something that you want to kind of take along with as a part of this discussion. So we do not say that there is any a positive or a negative sign attached to a variance. A variance could be a favorable variance denoted by F, and an adverse variance could be called as an A variance, right? So that is how you would like to, let's say, explain this kind of a situation, right? Not just this point in time, we would also be talking about the relevance of the elements of variances, right? Let's even take an example around it in terms of what is the idea of, let's say, elements of variances here. So let us say that a company X thought that it would make a sale of, so we name it as a standard. It was assuming that it would make a sale of, let's say, $20,000, let's say in a particular month. So let's say month 1. It worked on the numbers, it tried to sense the market, and it identified that the company would be obviously able to make a sale of, let's say, $20,000 in this month. The actual sales also came as $20,000, right? Now, where's the variance? Is there any difference between the actual performance versus the standard expected ought to be results? The answer is no. Should I say that there is no variance? Well, on the face of it, there is none. But then, let's try to look at a step ahead on this. Let's try to get into the details of this calculation. When I looked at this calculation, standard sales, the company thought that they will be able to sell 2,000 units at the rate of $10 per unit. They thought that they will be able to sell 2,000 units at the rate of $10 per unit. But actually, they sold off 1,600 units at the rate of $12.50 per unit, right? So now you start wondering that something is a challenge here, that there is some problem here. And what is that problem? Let's even try to mark it. We thought that we would be able to sell 2,000 units, let's say, in month 1. But then we actually sold off 1,600 units, right? So if I really, go back to the chain of sequences, let's look back at when I wanted to sell something, what all I would have planned for, right? So we are saying that since I wanted to sell 2,000 units, I surely would have planned my production on the basis of 2,000 units, and I certainly would have planned my purchase of raw materials again on the basis of 2,000 units of finished goods. But then, am I actually selling 2000 units? The answer is no. I'm actually selling 1600 units. That means that somewhere I'm landing up creating an inventory of 400 additional units of finished goods. What does it mean? It probably means that since I'm unable to sell these 400 units as per the plan or as against the plan, if tomorrow the prices of these goods decline considerably, then I would probably have a significant write-off in my books, a write-off of the inventory. Now, if I take you back to an example where Samsung, one of the largest companies in the world in the mobile manufacturing industry, I'm so sorry. So when I look at that company, they came up with a great one of the most popular products, so called as the Galaxy Note, right? It was a star product by the company a few years ago. But then they over manufactured these goods. They anticipated that they will be able to sell a significantly higher number of units, and they made the production accordingly. But then things did not work the way they expected it to work, right? The things did not work, they expected these to work, and as a result, when they wanted to sell it at a later point in time, because they were actually they already had done a significant amount of manufacturing for such units, they landed up selling those items at literally throwaway prices, right? So you would certainly want to identify, establish the right set of standards for both your sales and costs, and accordingly, by doing a variance analysis at elementary level instead of totality, because there is no variance here at all. You would probably want to drill down further to identify the real amount of variance. And let's even talk about it briefly here before we go into the technicalities of the topic. I was assuming that I will sell 2000 units, but I sold 1600 units. That means that there is an adverse variance as far as the quantity is concerned. There is an adverse variance with respect to the quantity sold. I was thinking of selling 2000. I was assuming that yes, 2000 units will be sold off, but I only sold off 1600 units, which means I have not performed as good as I was supposed to. And that is where there comes an adverse variance with respect to the quantity. But on the other hand, if I look at it, I was assuming that I will be selling my goods at $10 per unit, but I sold them off at 12.5, which means that there is a favorable variance with respect to the price, right? So somewhere you might even be able to connect these two, as in, since the price was higher, the quantity sold was lower. The price was higher than expected. That is where, or that is why the quantity sold was lower than expected. So somewhere you find the variances interrelated to each other. You certainly want to draw similar kind of conclusions to arrive at the right reason for such variances. And that is something which is the beauty of this topic, standard costing, which says that analyze the performance of a company. Look at it, how the company has performed in reality as against the benchmarks, as against the standards, as against it was supposed to be, right? And that is how you start evaluating this topic of standard costing, right? So that is something we're going to talk about precisely when I look at this idea of standard costing in detail. Of course, we will be doing a lot more discussions around this topic in terms of what are the various elements of standard costing, how do they really work in real life, how do we arrive at such standards and try to, of course, evaluate how to, of course, measure the performance of different people who are responsible for such variances. So that is something which is going to be an ongoing discussion for us on this particular topic of standard costing. So this is something that I wanted to cover in today's session in detail. Of course, we'll be continuing with the topic going forward. Until then, good preparation, all the very best for your examinations, and do well. All the best. Good, take care. Bye.